Alright, today's At a Glance is going to be looking at the RPG system straight to VHS. So before I get into this, this is not exactly what I intended for the game, or for this video to be about, or how it was going to be structured. I initially recorded me doing a live first impression of the system, and sadly that didn't go over so well, and instead of trying to fake a real interaction, I'm going to instead record audio because that was the problem with the initial video, was the audio. So this is still going to be kind of off the cuff. I'm still going to go based off of what my memory is. I might open the file and look at it. I'm going to show stills of things instead of having me actually live go through it. So I will hopefully be able to do something with it that'll still make it salvageable. So if you hear clicking in the background or typing, that is me using computer to look at it because it is in the form of a PDF. So here you can see the cover of it is very, very well designed. I think it, it could probably use a little more of a professional touch, but that's not a big deal. I'm not going to write it against it. It's created by Ryan Mellon. When I was going through this game, so some key features that I really pointed out was in the initial part there is a section under where the credits of it where it says, hey, there's a lot to love about bad movies from the VHS era, however they can be callous, gignostic, and downright hostile towards women. Straight to VHS does not revel in worst tendencies of these movies, but it echoes and plays with some of their bad habits. When Straight to VHS jokes about punching commies in the mouth, or when it presents the hobo character option, an actual character option, we intend no serious comment about political violence, homelessness, or any other issue. We mean to poke at the ham-fistedness of wild retro movies. And my favorite part of this disclaimer is authenticity is a lousy excuse for treating other players without respect. Be awesome instead. And if it's not obvious why I brought that out specifically as a point, is because I think though this game is playing up with the straight to VHS kind of 80s 90s movies and playing up with that like campiness of it, it's not an excuse to be shitty to one another. So, be excellent, don't be shitty. And then as you get into it, it has a nice, very simple and clean. I think, I'm not an expert on these kind of things, but I think it has a really clean table of contents, and from an accessibility standpoint, it seems like it's pretty good. I later comment that it may be possible that this is, and it's just a slight criticism, is that they may in like really deep into the book, and it's like I think the last like 5 pages was where this comes up as a main problem for me. Not that I actually have a personal problem with this, I just think it's something that those with maybe certain types of color blindness or minor cases of color blindness might struggle with the fact that sometimes the text is put in pink and blue, and these like very specific pinks and blues that I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure result in some people having a problem with reading, and in one particular circumstance it becomes very difficult. It would become very difficult for somebody with that issue to differentiate between them. If it's not actually a real problem, then that criticism is founded on poor knowledge on my part. Maybe I should do more research. And I'd be happy for somebody to inform me that I was wrong, and it's not a big deal anyways. But it's really a small slight against the game. Overall, I think the game is pretty well designed. Like I said, the table of contents, it's very straightforward. It's very easy, in my opinion, to determine what is a section title and what is underneath those sections. I've seen in a lot of games, even though they use larger font or indentations, they don't make use of font color, and this game does a really good job at using font color to further help separate those sections instead of just putting indentations, because it's very easy I find for myself to just skip through things despite the indents being there, and even under circumstances where they are more pronounced, I'll completely miss that it's underneath this section. And I just really appreciate that. It's really good at laying out in a sense of table of contents what you're going to be looking at and what the game is kind of about without even having to read the rules. It goes into this very nice introduction, I think, that helps, again, further establish what the game is about, if it wasn't clear by now, by you looking at this thing. By the way, I should have said this at the beginning, this is completely free. You would see from the cover that it was a playtest edition that I'm looking at. It's the most recent version of the game as far as I'm aware. The subreddit is mainly the way that I was exposed to it. And if that information isn't up to date, then their website isn't either, because I double checked the website to make sure I had the latest edition. But it's completely free. Anybody can go to it. You can go to their website and download this right now. So if the game has any interest to you, especially the subject matter, and just from this 7-minute introduction I've done so far, you'll probably really want to play this game. But I think it does a really good job at establishing not just with words what this game is about, but also displaying that through its mechanics. I threw around in the initial, I wouldn't say threw around, but I used a couple of times the term ludonarrative harmony. If you're not familiar with what that is, then just look it up, because I'm not going to explain it to you, because I don't feel like I am smart enough to explain it to you without making a mistake. But it does a great job at that, I think. So, one thing I remember specifically in my talk about this was that it has a page, and I initially was like, oh, I'm really glad this game didn't do this, but I'm now glad that the way it presents it, and that an issue that I have is when games have a section that is, what is role-playing, or what exactly is role-playing, and it bothers the hell out of me, because it not only assumes that people who are, most of the time you have to be at least somewhat exposed to the hobby to want to even be picking up one of these books, right? Or for somebody to be around that can tell you what that thing is without you needing a book to tell you. So for me, whenever a book says, what exactly is role-playing, or what are role-playing games anyways, or whatever, I just want to chuck that book out of a window, sometimes literally, but most of the time metaphorically, because it just seems condescending, and it also rarely is helpful or accurate, in my opinion. Humble opinion. But specifically, as you can see right now, this page does a really good job at not being condescending, just by the pure fact that it makes two sections. On the left, you have one that is for people that are completely new, have no idea what's going on, have stumbled across this completely by accident, which is totally possible that could happen, even if I personally think it would be unlikely. And then you have another section with somebody who is just seasoned within the hobby, or just somewhat exposed to the hobby, and it makes this more tolerable, not only because the one on the left again sticks with the theme of what the game is trying to emulate, but also because it doesn't say it in a talky downy way. I don't know why I chose to add Y's to the end of those words for no reason, but it's kind of more taking the piss out of it than anything. I don't think it's taking itself too seriously when it's not trying to say we know what role-playing games are, or poorly explaining them. It's just also kind of establishing more in a way, and I wish it would lean into this more, the sense of, hey, I'm I'm not telling you what role-playing games are. I'm telling you what this role-playing game is, or what we think our role-playing game is, right? I feel like it doesn't do that 100%, but it kind of leans a little more towards that. And then the other side is like, hey, if you're familiar with role-playing games, but you don't know why you should play this one, let us tell you what it's about and why it's a little bit different and what we intend to do with it. And this is all, and the reason I'm not annoyed by the what is role-playing section, which is not called that, obviously, you can see that, but it might as well be. It, under the pure fact that it puts pick one at the top. Instead of doing what, and because it puts it in these two columns, instead of doing what most games do, is they put the what is role-playing, and then they put, like, if you're familiar, but they don't ever say, like, if you are familiar either. And that's another thing I want to say, is that it specifically says, hey, you don't have to read that other section. I did. I read it because I was like, hey, it's important to read this thing and try to understand from, like, a design perspective why this can be necessary and if it can be done well. And I think it was done well in this circumstance, helped by the fact that it tells you, hey, pick one. It's like, pick your lane. Are you this or are you that? Because you're very unlikely to be anywhere in between that. Then it gets into directly explaining the core mechanics of the game system, the rules and stuff, but it doesn't carry on too long about that, which is a plus. It has a little bit of a preamble, but it's more leading into it to kind of, like, help establish it, because some people are just going to skip right past the opening section of this, and that kind of sucks, but they're aware of that, so they're trying to make sure you're not going into this completely blind. It also has a very nice, to help keep this all to one book, and I'm sure they don't 100% mean this on purpose, but the fact that it says, hey, these little specific boxes, which I'm going to show, you can see right now, are for the director, which is their term for game master in this game. And I think, one, director is a great term to help establish what you're kind of looking for from a game master. You're not here to master the game, or to be a rules referee. You're here to direct things in a substantial manner, in a dramatic manner, and to encourage certain actions that are more interesting and dramatic for the purposes of telling a fun, campy, cheesy story. It kind of covers the role results and the role mechanics as well in this opening part. And something I really enjoy is that it has, though it clearly is intending for combat to be a part of the system, it doesn't have a deep combat system either. It has just enough to be what you would expect from a game that is about VHS movies of this type. And specifically something I touched on, which I think more games are starting to do, is not having everything be on a binary of yes, no, pass, fail, save or die, which was so prominently pushed by one of the largest names and origins of the hobby. And it specifically has, like, you can, on an attack, you could get double damage and a lucky break, or you can just get double damage. But, like, if you get double damage, you don't necessarily get a lucky break, and these lucky breaks are like things that, like, oh, you get a good thing that comes out of it, a fortunate circumstance based off of what you did. So you have this, like, I succeeded, and then ignoring in combat, it can be I succeeded, and then with a lucky break, it would be not only did I succeed, but I also got this extra thing that I didn't know I was gonna get, or it was possible, I knew I could possibly get, but it wasn't guaranteed on success. And it also has tough breaks, the inverse of that, and I think the mechanic for it being like a D6 dice pool system, sorry, that is very well designed. And though I personally don't like most dice pool systems for reasons I'm not going to go into, I think this game does a decent job of trying to not get into those issues that I may normally have. It also does a really good step-by-step example for those who needed it. It even helped me to confirm that yes, if you get double damage on an attack, you can stack it with a lucky break. A lucky break is not a replacement of double damage, for instance. Then it goes into some more mechanics. It has like tokens that you can use to do interesting things with. I compared these to bennies because those are the ones that I'm most familiar with directly and instantly, because I used to play a good amount of Savage Worlds. But it's not exactly like Savage Worlds, and at least in the Explorers Edition, Savage Worlds 1. I know in Adventures Edition they probably would be closer to, but this game came out before Adventures Edition did, or the concept of tokens was in there before Adventures Edition came out, so it's not like they took it from Savage Worlds. I don't even know how much they're influenced by Savage Worlds. So yeah, it goes into like a very basic like mechanics at a glance thing, so you have an idea of like what action sequences are for the player, so they don't have to read it like too much, but they get an understanding of what's kind of going on. It goes into scenes and acts, and something that I think, again, I'm going to touch back on ludonarrative harmony. As I mentioned earlier, this is the first example of this, where it says, hey, the game has typically a 3-act structure, and those acts can be broken up into 3 scenes. And I go into saying like, hey, that's a great example of like, not only is like, obviously most people know that stories are told in 3-act structures. Duh, we know that. But those scenes, we also like think of movies and scenes, movies in terms of scenes, which is more, I think, more common of a term than acts are, in the sense of like storytelling for the average moviegoer. But the fact that that means you now have a way to measure not how long a session would last in real life time, but in terms of game time. So you know that when a typical game is going to last 9 scenes, so you can have a clock going in where all of the people at the table, all players, director and actors, I don't think it calls them actors in this, but I wouldn't put it past anybody to use that instead of players, that everybody at the table will know, generally speaking, most of their sessions are going to involve 9 scenes that each take up a part, 3 of which each take up a part of one of the 3 acts. And so that allows players to know going in, hey, when the director says a scene, this is the end of the scene, which is something that the director will specifically tell the players, or the heroes, that's the term it uses. It will tell the heroes, hey, this is the end of a scene, because it mechanically matters when a scene ends. And also, that tells the player how much closer they are to the end, which encourages them to act accordingly, right? Like, if you know we only have 2 scenes left, you're going to be more likely to go for the big finisher, right? You're going to be more likely to go for the cool jump across the chasm. You're going to be more willing to risk these dangerous things because you know that this is where the action is about to stop. Like, this is the end of the tape, so to speak. It has things in here where it has like script changes and montages. So we're going to talk about script changes real quick, in that like the players are given a position of narrative authority in the sense that they can change something. Now, obviously, the director has some veto over this, but really not a lot. Like, it's not like the director can just flat say no. It doesn't specifically say that. In fact, it specifically says under script changes, players get to temporarily hijack the director's narration when they earn a script change, which can happen by getting lucky breaks, and specifically by showing weakness, which is like you're putting your character in a bad circumstance or having their vice or a weakness being displayed and actively harming who they are. And so that allows not only the player to have some kind of narrative authority, and it taking away some of that narrative authority specifically from the director, which in my opinion is good, because then it doesn't put as much pressure on me to improvise things. And also it allows my players to say explicitly, without having to hope that I put it in there, this is what I want to happen to my character. So I just think that's really great. And I had something else I was going to say that there was going to be a but I don't remember what it was. And not a bad but more like a good but, with the two T's kind of but. No, I think this is just a good thing in general, and again, fits with what they're trying to do. And then montages on top of that. Basically, a montage is something that explains away, quote unquote, leveling up. The concept of leveling up. There's not actual levels in this system, so that's a plus if you like levelless systems and classless systems. This game is definitely for you in that regard. But montages are essentially things that happen to Montages are essentially things that signify your character is engaging in some kind of growth, right? And not just to be like, you've reached enough XP to go up, because there is no XP. You just, when the director says there is a montage, you get a montage and your hero becomes more powerful. And there are certain things that are affected by how many montages you've had as well. So it kind of acts in like a level, but not in the way that you think, right? So it's like, I think later there was like some ability that you get back, you get a number of hit points back equal to X plus your montage, or number of montages. So you'll be like, I'm going to regain hit points. Apologies. I'm going to regain hit points based off of how much my character is trained, essentially. It covers stats. It has something. Okay, I wanted to note here from what I remember is I specifically point out that spycraft is a main attribute of your character. Attributes being like, what we typically associate them with in like games like D&D, Pathfinder, Traveler, Call of Cthulhu, your main core abilities that you use for making tests that pretty much modify all your rolls, and then are modified further, the rolls of which are modified further by like things like skills and such. But I specifically wanted to pick out that spycraft is a stat because it deals with things like perception, deceit, and sneaking. And just the name spycraft is a huge deal, right? Like, if you sit down to play a game and one of the stats is spycraft, that immediately says something about what you can do in this game and what this game is about. Now, it's not entirely focused on that, but it clearly establishes that's important for your character to be that's so important that it's a core component of every character in this world. So mentioned earlier, it's a d6 pool system. You take a number of dice equal to the stat which is most relevant. Another thing it touches on here, and then you modify with other parts of it, things like your tropes, your gimmicks. Again, good names. Some items might change values that you roll. And then you have things like problems and I think something else I can't remember right now, but the idea is being like, oh, there's something hindering you, then you lose some of your dice. But something it specifically notes here in the GM section is that the director doesn't need to assume that every action is going to fit neatly into a single stat, and the fact that not only the game acknowledges that thing exists, that like sometimes the thing you're trying to do could be strength based or it could be charisma based, right? Like trying to intimidate somebody, you might try to be just using your force of personality, your aura of bravado, whereas some other times it may be you literally picking something up and snapping it in half, or ripping a phone book in two pieces with a single tear, right? To me, strength, that second one is a strength-based intimidation. Whereas like the first one could be something like I'm going to put my hand down on the table and give them an intense look. You may not be physically strong or brawny or even large, but just your mere presence is enough to make somebody feel uncomfortable. And so I think that it specifically points it out, and then it further goes into saying, let the player choose, the hero, choose which one to use in that circumstance under reason, understanding that they are obviously going to have to explain how that stat works in this circumstance, how it applies, and it has to make sense. It has to be reasonable. You can't just be like, I'm using charisma to convince the computer that I'm hacking it, even though the computer doesn't have sentience and it's just a normal Macintosh from the 90s. And then it has hit points, which it has two different types of hit points here, where it has shields and hearts. And you don't lose hearts except under physical damage. So it has the separation of shields being that you can lose them on physical damage, but you can also lose it on narrative damage. So it could be something like, as it lays out in the book, your spouse being kidnapped, or having your criminal history revealed. So it covers that later in the book, but it's just something that I think it does a really good job at, where it establishes that, hey, there's a difference between there's two different types of hit points, but they both apply. And so you can go through your shields first, and eventually, if you take enough damage in shields, you can only take physical hits. So there's a point where like narrative hits, like, I guess in a way this is saying that like narrative hits wouldn't matter after a certain point, that you can only be hurt by physical attacks. And then obviously when you run out of like hit points, you enter a certain state, which I think is very interesting, because it doesn't just say you flat out die or you go incapacitated. It just limits what you can do, but you can still act normally. You just take negative dice, and then you can also mark down your hearts permanently into an X mark instead of just a single slash through them, and you don't heal those the same way you would normally heal, so you can kind of push yourself beyond normal limits to risk your life and limb and gain permanent injuries. And then another thing it says specifically about hearts is that they don't have to be just when you get cut by like a sword or whatever, right? It's more in the sense of like how TSR intended for hit points to be used in D&D, where they're more like stamina. Like your final heart being taken should be the one that causes you to bleed or be a major injury or a major slash across the chest. It shouldn't be every single one is a sword cutting into your flesh. It should be you narrowly avoid it instead of always being hit by it. Another thing to touch on in reference to shields, when all of your shields are gone, so I mentioned earlier that, like, I guess technically speaking, that if you run out of shields, you can't be hurt by narrative hits anymore or narrative damage, but you can, but when you lose all your shields, you also get a bonus die. So it provokes the player into wanting to take those narrative hits as a response to getting a reward. It also, like, bad guys have shields, and the state is called nothing to lose, and having shields be like, hey, once you run out of these, like, yeah, it sucks because you're closer to being on death's door, but you also get this bonus die. So it's going to push players to put themselves in circumstances that will naturally cause narrative damage to their characters. So they want to get their spouse kidnapped because, like, outside of the fact that, hey, by the way, that makes for interesting plot, like, now the plot's progressing because your character has motivation to do something, but it also pushes the player mechanically to be encouraged to do that thing. And a lot of players are more motivated by reward than they are, or by progression and cool abilities than they are by making a cool story. as much as it hurts to say that, it's the truth. And so having something there that helps teach players, hey, this is actually a good thing to have happen to you. Like it comes with a downside, but there's also good things that come with it as well. It makes a more compelling story, and it encourages players to engage in that compelling story and to actively seek out those bad events, so they can be like, well, come on, man, hit me with some narrative damage so I can get that cool D6. Like, kidnap my wife or something. I don't fucking care. I'm not going to go over the range and movement too much, or distance or whatever, but it is a very, like, interesting system. I'm pretty sure it's very similar to how, like, Fate does movement, and some other games have done, like, distance and stuff. It's more abstract. It's not intended to be used with any kind of markings on a board or anything. You can pretty much play the whole thing theater of the mind, which I'm kind of mixed on, but that's more of my opinion on doing theater of the mind in general. It works better for a game like this that's more narrative based, I think. So I'm not like, this game sucks because it uses the blah, blah, blah. I'm just saying that I'm kind of indifferent about it. I think it makes sense for this kind of game. And it does it pretty okay. It actually has a mechanic for using your athletic stat to actually matter what your move distance is. And it doesn't just say, like, it doesn't just say these distances all willy-nilly. It actually makes good use out of them and explains what that means. So then it goes over, like, making your character, and then it has tropes, which are essentially like, they're kind of like establishing your archetype of your character, and you get to pick two of them so you can mix and match. So it establishes specifically one thing about this is that if your character has a trope, that means they are that thing, but that doesn't mean they're not other things. It just means that you get mechanical benefits, like these specific elements of your character matter mechanically. So for instance, the one example it uses is saying that, like, you could be a hobo that is also a badass. Like, you could be, or you could be batshit crazy and a hobo, and those are your mechanical tropes. Those are the ones that matter about your character. It says who they are as, like, an archetype, what they can do, what they're capable of. But you could also still be a robot. It's just you wouldn't have any mechanical benefit for being a robot. That would just be flavor, and it specifically says that, and I think that's really nice. But it also, in the section of tropes, I'm not going to go over all of them again, but there are, like, one of my favorites was the fact that it has, I'm going to cover two. One of them is Born Wild, which is basically saying that you have an animal companion. And it makes animal companions work without making them too simple or too boiled down that it becomes basically useless. Instead, it gives you just enough that you can work with it, and it gives you abilities that are very quick, punchy, and make sense and work mechanically well. So it's like, one of them you can do it as a free action. It's called Beastmaster, and it says once per scene at any time your animal companion can take a full turn of its own, and you spend 2 tokens to use this ability an extra time. So you can do it once per scene, but you can then spend your tokens to have your animal companion act out a full turn. Whereas I think normally, let me double check. To your stats, remaining stats 0. You can monetize one of animal stats instead, give them a shield. Can't speak or use items. Okay, so it doesn't specifically say, but I think that's actually a positive, is it's saying that your animal companion basically acts, I'm probably just missing it, but it says right here in the special ability that it gets a full turn. So normally that means that it can't take a full turn. And another thing that one of the abilities that it gives is that it gives you the ability to ask questions to random animals, but it says at the end of this that not only the director provides a simple answer, which you somehow gathered from the animal, but it specifically states in one sentence Animals are not all-knowing, which is a thing that is often forgotten by a lot of people when they're using abilities that let them talk to animals. These people are like, this bird should just tell me where the dungeon is, and it's just like, it doesn't know where the dungeon is because it doesn't know what a dungeon is, right? So like I just like that. Another one in here that I specifically liked was Net Hacker, I believe was what it was. That it says like, once per scene you can earn a token as a free action by doing something that supports the cliche that hackers are nerdy or weird. And it's just like, that's flavorful, and it's encouraging you to play your character more, right? Like, it's encouraging you to lean into the stereotype of this because you're playing a VHS movie, right? Like, this isn't meant to be taken too seriously. It has like a really long secondary ability and then a third ability, though, that I really liked, which is Double Hack, which is once per scene, spend a token to gain another use of Hackatronic. And so it lets you like called Double Hack. So it's like, let's just go over what Hackatronic is then. So it's like, once per scene, wirelessly access an electronic device that you have line of sight to. For the rest of the scene, you can use a minor action to hack it in any way the director considers remotely feasible. For example, overheat, extract information, reprogram, etc. The director may require rolls with one or more passes for devices that the director considers secure. And I just like that because it's like, it says as long as it's electronic and you can see the device, you can hack it. It doesn't matter if it has, like, it says wirelessly access it, but it doesn't say that the device has to have like wireless interfacing. You can maybe imply that from the scene, but you know, the genre that we're playing in, I think we can all agree that the player should just be able to do it as long as the thing is electronic. Hack the planet and all that nonsense. So yeah, you get into this, you got a lot of choices. I'm not going to count them all, but like, it's a pretty good amount of choices for character customization, and they all have very flavorful and fitting mechanics. You can even play as a vampire or werewolf. Yep. And then it gets into these things called gimmicks, which gives you even further character customization, which are also like not only mechanically sound, but flavorful and fitting. Again, ludonarrative harmony is aces here. Scroll. Go into items, and not really a lot to say here, even though I do agree with the sentiment that system equals setting, even though this is meant to be a little more quote-unquote generic in the sense that it's able to capture multiple genres. It's still doing the overarching genre that I'm sure you and I are well aware of by now, but it does a really good job at laying out like what is possible, and it also helps you, like, if you don't have like it gives you some examples, like it says like Zeta Cluster Beam for like normal ranged weapons, but it also has a chart. Two things I wanted to say here. It has a chart for like making a ranged weapon, basically. That's very simple and easy to understand, and it even says like, if you want to make it gives you a +1 bonus weapon, but it's only for close, for the normal range, and then it has a blast range, which I'm not going to go into the mechanics of that are because I didn't really read them, because I didn't think they were important. But it changes the price based on whether or not that weapon is a one-use price or a multi-use, right? So like, if it's just a one and done, if it's Derringer, for instance, it's going to be much cheaper because you can only use it once. And not like, I don't mean the ammo capacity of the weapon, I mean like the gun isn't, you just can't use it again after that, for instance. But the other thing I specifically want to talk about is, even though it has a pretty decent list of items to cover most circumstances and helps you kind of build out things, it specifically, after all that, says at the end, and because this is player facing, you gotta remember this is specifically for the players, and there's a section that's just for the directors. It has an item that's just called That Thing, and it's just, got an idea? ask the director about it, and the price is question mark in dollars. And I just like that because it immediately says, hey, not everything's going to be here. And it says this to the directors later in the directors section, where it's like, hey, not every single item, not every single circumstance is going to be covered by these rules. Sometimes you're going to have to come up with some stuff. But it's putting this in the hands specifically of the players to say, hey, do you not see Porter's X2 ray gun on this list and you want that? Just ask your director, and you can work together to figure out what that is and what it costs. Then it has a really nice section of how to play. It covers like what happens at the beginning of an act, when a scene ends, like you get different things based off of that. You get you can turn in tokens at the end of a scene to heal. It recharges certain special abilities, and then it has like when a new act begins, you get all of your HP back, which allows you to be consciously aware again to go back to that idea that there's a 3-act structure, and typically each act is made up of 3 scenes. That means that the players will know going into the final scene that they can, if they haven't already pushed themselves, they can fully push themselves, knowing that at the end of the scene, not only could they, like at the end of the scene, obviously they could heal, but it would be stupid to spend a token to do that. Not only will they get their special abilities back that recharge at the end of a scene, but at the beginning of this next act, they're going to get all their HP back, and all their special abilities are going to recharge. So they know going into this, like no matter what, in a third scene, if you're playing typically how the rules expects you to, you can push yourself to that limit, and it's going to encourage players to do that because they're going to see, hey, might as well, I've got HP to burn, like what do I got to lose? And then it covers montages a little more in depth and how that like it corresponds to you increasing your characters. It gives a little bit of advice for GMs to like, hey, depending on what kind of campaign you're running or what kind of game you're running, you may want to stretch these out a little further away from one another, or you may want to have them more frequent. And then it talks about script changes and how showing weakness can get you them and how that's actually beneficial. And specifically showing weakness is, it's saying a consequential task, where like consequential is when you do something that has negative consequences. So if you do something like, the example they lay out is this can be consequential in some circumstances, not consequential in others, is remembering the order of the planets before setting a course on a spaceship. That's going to be different than if you're just trying to remember the order of the planets because somebody was asking you what the order of the planets was. It's like just some random dude on the street asks you what the order of the planets are. You can probably be like, I don't need to fucking answer that, right? Whereas like trying to take your spaceship up into space, you might want to know so you don't actually overshoot Mars. It's the one right after Earth, by the way. But yeah, it also covers what you can do with script changes. It does this really good job at laying out what you can do and what you can't do with script changes, so the player knows. It even has specifically, you can have a truth revealed, but it can't be a truth that changes a character sheet. So you couldn't have your character suddenly gain a trope that they don't have, even if you establish that, hey, my batshit crazy hobo is secretly a robot. It's like you couldn't suddenly have that change from hobo to robot. You know, obviously you can hack it, but by the rules, you can't have something true revealed to the table or to the narrative, and that change somebody's character sheet. But you can have things like, you can do mishaps, you can have a thing is at hand, but you can't make it like a bunch of cash. You can't make it cash or some super ultra powerful thing or item or whatever. You can have a mishap occur, like I said, but it can't take out a major character, so you can't have the main villain die in scene 2 of Act 1 because the anvil slipped off of the conveyor belt and smashed down on them. Like, you could have it be that it makes them drop something or like causes them to be injured, but it wouldn't take them out of the situation. It would just make them possibly have to flee or something, right? So it's like, oh, I'll get you next time, Gadget. It covers action sequences. It does a good job of actually laying out like the anatomy of a turn, and it displays easily what the different types of actions there are. It all fits on one page too, which is a great. It does cover move actions on a separate page, and then it covers like doing attacks and stuff, which it does a good job of covering what narrative attacks mean and when you should use them and what they affect and how they're different and stuff. And I think it does a really great job with that. It makes it clear that this game isn't just meant to be punching people in the face or whatever, right? It does a good job of actually being a narrative game because you can apply narrative consequences without just saying this bad thing happens. You can actually have it codified into the example of losing a shield. And that can mean different things. You can even use it against bad guys as well because they have shields as well. Some more things. It encourages stuff like getting the upper hand. It has a rule that's usually something that I feel like you shouldn't have to put in the game, but it does a good job of displaying in a way. They call it the stunt rule, where it's like, hey, if the person does something that should be cool or makes sense that they should get some kind of positive benefit from it or some kind of negative downside, then it says, let me just read it word for word. If a hero does something that seems like it should be consequential, but no rule in the game appears to apply to it, then it's like, not colon, wow, what the fuck is wrong with me? Bullet point, it directly affects the in-game situation, and then bullet point, or it creates a boon or problem. So I like that they actually use the word consequential here correctly, and that like consequential is neutral. It can be positive, it can be negative. It's not exclusively one or the other. But that aside, the point is that it's saying like it's using this, but it's also, it clarifies, hey, this isn't to always be used. It's just used when you need something quick, you need something done right now, and you don't want to slow down the fun of the game or hinder the cool action of a player as a result. And it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't say use this all the time. It's just basically when you need to make a decision and you want to keep things moving, you want to keep things snappy, do this. It's a very good baseline to start with, but it doesn't expect you to only use it. I'm being a little bit repetitive here, sorry. But it's really good, and I like that because it doesn't try to tell, it doesn't do the thing that I think is kind of annoying in some systems where it just expects you to always use these two options to make things more interesting. It's just like, start here when you don't know what else to do. And then it gives really good GM advice, though it calls it Directing 101. Again, I think the way things are named in this and the way it's presented is just, chef's kiss. And it makes sure not to be like, this is how you should do it. It's like, no, in the opening sentence, not only, like, it obviously the opening section says this should only be read by the director, or only needs to be read by the director, and then it says players get the hell out of here, basically. And it says, obviously, if everyone's having fun, you're doing it right. But in the proper advice of like setting up the movie, as it says, you're treating like each session should be like a movie or an installment, right, of the series. And it says right in the opening sentence, if you don't already have ideas on how to set up and structure your movie adventure, here's a suggestion. It's not telling you how to do it. It's not telling you this is the only way to do it. It's not trying to tell you that you should do it this way. It's just saying, hey, here's a suggestion if you don't already have an idea. And that's good because it's friendly to newbies, but it's also friendly to people that might be new to this kind of game. And it gives a couple of good suggestions, I think, for places to start. And another thing that I think some game systems that give this kind of advice that don't do that others, or this one does that I think others don't do, or it's very rare that it does, or it doesn't cover it very well, is that it says integrating the player characters, or the heroes in this case. Something that I think this game does, it specifically calls out, hey, it's cool that you put down uh, aliens that are invading the planet, but the players need to care about this, right? Like, you need to actually make the players want to engage with it. Otherwise, they're just going to feel like they're being strung along. Even if it is a railroaded game, make the railroad be the one they want to be on, because their characters matter to it, right? And even though I don't always think that the characters or that the PCs need to be the primary um, source in the world, or even in like the overarching narrative, this game is specifically going for a certain feeling, a certain vibe, and I think it makes sense to have that be more assumed than not, right? To be like, hey, you should make this cool narrative should be pulling in the heroes, not just expecting them to want to be pulled into it. And it does a really good job of, like I said, it doesn't just say this, it also gives you examples. And I think it does a really good job at laying examples out in a way that doesn't just say, like, just involve them, whatever. And then finally, right before I get into the inspiration section, which I think is extremely important, I just wanted to briefly mention that it gives advice on bad guys. It tells you not only like how to build them and how to tweak them on the fly, which I may not 100% agree with, but it gives decent advice on that, and it makes sense for what you're trying to do. It also gives really good examples of what kind of bad guys there could be. Like, not just saying, like, here's a narrative example, but here's an actual mechanical example. And, like, you get, like, basically little stat blocks for them. But now, going into the inspiration sections, it obviously gives a recommended viewing where it covers, like, here's the different subjects from it. The only thing I think that's missing from it, even though it has things like Army of Darkness, Big Trouble in Little China, Miami Connection, Mortal Kombat, Road Warrior, Samurai Cop, it misses out the one thing I wish that was on this list that I feel like should be in this day and age is Kung Fury. If you haven't seen Kung Fury is, like, to me, this game before this game came out, right? Like, if you told me you made this game and you didn't have any inspiration from Kung Fury, I would be surprised, and then I would say you should go look it up on YouTube. It's completely free, legally, and you can watch it right now. It is literally this game. It is reveling in that VHS era kind of B movie, straight to VHS kind of production, and it doesn't shy away from that at all, and it encourages it and it revels in it. And I'm sorry, but if this game has caught your eye at all, then, and you haven't seen Kung Fury, then go watch Kung Fury, because that's also a good thing. Like, if you just want a 35, maybe 40-minute long, basically movie that's actually really well made, despite being just ridiculous and over the top, it's worth looking at for a summarization of what this game, I think's thesis statement is. And this is also the section where it says, like, I said, like, it would have served better to maybe not have these colors in this kind of order when it goes into suggestion for character traits for heroes or director-controlled characters, where it's not mechanical, but, like, it has this list, and though it's indented nicely, which I think would help with any color reading issues, and again, this is very minor, but the fact that it uses these very similar colors that I'm pretty sure that, like, if I just stare at the page long enough, they kind of fade together, blend together, and, like, some of them will fade and I just won't be able to focus on them as much. I don't have that color blindness, at least I don't think I do, so I don't know from personal experience, but it's just based off of what I know, and if memory serves well, that would be the only criticism I would put on the game from like a layout standpoint. But yeah, and then it has a hero sheet that you can use, and it has a section on the hero sheet that's specifically for saying stuff like what your character's dream and goals, what troubles them, and then it has a section to actually mark those things off as used, which doesn't apply to all of them, obviously, but it's like, if you've used up your dream or goal, you can mark that off, so you don't have to immediately replace it right then and there, but you can be like, oh, I've used this, right? I know that this is, my character's achieved this, so now I can, at the end of the session or between sessions, I can erase that and put in something new. And that's pretty much it. That's the system. I don't typically try to say like whether or not I would recommend these things on at a glance. I try to just kind of give an overview of it. Again, this wasn't the format I was hoping it would be. I was hoping to have a more live recording of it, but I didn't want to have to go back and re-record all of my things because it just didn't feel as genuine. And hopefully this has given you a good idea, though, of whether or not this game is for you. And at the very least, it has exposed you to different types of games that exist within this hobby, which is, honestly, I think overall this is a very innovative and pretty inclusive game, despite the subject matter. That it's going more for, like, to revel in the campiness more than the actual poor aspects of it. Yeah. So hopefully you've enjoyed. But until next time, be kind, rewind.